Good morning and welcome to What is True. I'm Don Patton. Together with Dennis Carroll, we talk to you on Sunday mornings about truth, the truth of the Word of God. We began a series last Sunday about archaeology of the New Testament. We speak often of archaeology of the Old Testament, and there is much more that is known. And I think one of the reasons is that we're dealing with Israel, and they are much more favorable to evidence that would support the Old Testament. The New Testament, not so much. We find that there is often fierce opposition against evidence, especially really strong, good evidence that would sustain faith in the New Testament. We began talking about the James ossuary, which is an excellent example. They really didn't want this to be true. This is the first page of Biblical Archaeology Review, which describes the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus, that's found in Jerusalem. Finally, after a 7-year battle, now that's fierce opposition, they were defeated. An Israeli judge in a country that is 98% non-Christian ruled. This was not guilty regarding the one who was charged with forgery with the James ossuary, which is inscribed with James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. The combination of those three names presents very strong evidence, especially when it was found exactly where history records that James was killed and was buried. We went on to talk about Herod and his work throughout Israel, one of the major characters in the New Testament. It's undeniable, it's just monumental when you begin to view the evidence of King Herod. We began talking about the unbelievable conduct of Herod, killing babies 2 years old and younger so that he might eliminate any possible rival. And it's just amazing. How would anybody do that? Well, if you know Herod, that's not amazing. It's pretty typical. And I think that'll become evident as we proceed this morning. We showed you the Chapel of the Innocents, where hundreds, perhaps 1,000 child skeletons were found, 2 years old and younger, with the Byzantine church built over it, commemorating the death of these children, or at least bringing to our remembrance. Herod is often described as a megalomaniac, and when we look at the history of the temple, restored initially by Ezra back in the, of course, prior to Christ's time, the Hasmonean period, the period between the Testaments, showed an enlargement, but then with Herod, the megalomaniac wanted to rival Solomon and exceed the glory of Solomon. And according to Josephus' description and others, this is what it looked like in the days of Christ, which is monumental. This is a tribute to Herod and a documentation of the fact that this fellow is real, and we've got his picture and his monuments all over the place. The colonnade, Herod's portico, referred to in Acts chapter 3, where the lame man was taken and where Peter and John preached to the crowd that came as a result, is described in detail by Josephus. It's truly monumental. His second palace was at Caesarea Maritime, which is up toward the north, of course, there on the seacoast. This is a picture from National Geographic's restoration. They're not a friend of Christianity by any means, but it is a marvel of engineering with underwater concrete and building procedures that rival the engineering that we see today. The ruins are truly amazing that can be seen today. They were destroyed by earthquakes and by other battles. But the pools and the colonnade around the palace of King Herod is seen here. This is where Paul stayed for 2 years, you recall. We'll look more at that in a moment. There's a monumental aqueduct that brings water to this area, or brought water. 30 miles of engineering to produce the effect that we see today. Another monumental monument is Masada, infamously known for the place where hundreds of Jews committed suicide rather than be killed by the Romans. The battle is a very interesting story, and not thoroughly, but somewhat controversially told today. But this was a huge desert fortress overlooking the Dead Sea, and you travel there by cable car today. It's just astounding to see the engineering that was accomplished at this site. Another unignorable monument of Herod is Herodium, a mountain, a man-made mountain. Now, we're told there's no evidence, and of course the Dallas Morning News, once they've had to acknowledge the ossuary was real, said, yeah, but it's the only thing. What about a mountain? That's pretty hard to ignore, built with slave labor by one of the main characters in the New Testament, King Herod, here about 8 miles southeast of Jerusalem. You can get an idea of the scale here as you look in the lower left-hand corner and see the little bitty cars, ant size, dwarfed by this huge monument to Herod, his mountain. There were huge circular towers on top, even a synagogue in deference to the Jews, but it was a place where he could be thoroughly Roman outside of Jerusalem. Some of it has been restored, but you can certainly see the monumental character of the buildings at the top of that mountain. Here, my beloved is seen about 2/3 of the way up. Looking over her shoulder, we see what was called the Playboy Complex of Herod, a place where he was thoroughly Roman and did kill a lot of people. He drowned his father-in-law, several of his 10 wives, 2 of his sons. He was known for this kind of cruelty. In fact, Caesar Augustus, who had appointed him here and under whom he served, made some jokes about the horrible cruelty of Herod, and actually made the comment that I'd rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son. Pigs are pretty safe in Israel, but not Herod's sons. At least 2 of them he drowned there in this pool. From the overhead site, you see that complex in the foreground, the monumental mountain in the background, and it was here that he chose to be buried. You see Josephus describing that tomb. 200 steps of the purest white marble led up to it. Well, purest white marble is good building stones, and they didn't like Herod. They tore down monuments after his death, and so this was not found. Here he says the top was crowned with circular towers. Its courtyard contained splendid structures. But then we see the headlines, 2007, Ehud Nesker, whom I've worked with on several occasions there in Israel, discovered the ancient tomb and was acknowledged and announced here by BBC. After a search of more than 30 years, Ehud Nesker of Hebrew University says he's located the tomb at Herodium, a site south of Jerusalem. Had searched a long time because it was destroyed and then another church built on top of it in the Byzantine period to cover it up. They didn't like Herod for good reason. But the site that you see The upper right-hand corner here is where it was found as the church was removed. Metzger is a very conscientious and I think honest archaeologist, or was. He was killed when the scaffolding at this site collapsed in October of 2010. I had been there just 2 months earlier, standing on that same scaffolding, which did collapse 2 months later and resulted in the death of Ehud. But he's seen here beside the very ornate sarcophagus, which had been beat to pieces. He puts it back together so that you can see what it looked like, and it was truly amazing, of course, designed by the megalomaniac Herod himself. But here is exactly what Josephus said, completely consistent with what we read in the New Testament, one of the main characters in the New Testament. Then, more recently, another discovery was made and announced here in Biblical Archaeology Review, a ring that had actually been found years earlier, but now then with advances in photographic technology, infrared, they were able to see what's actually encrusted there, actually engraved under the encrusted ring. And this is the name Pontius Pilate. They're visiting Herod at his mountain up in his palaces up top was Pontius Pilate, and somehow he left his ring there. Maybe he left with a scribe who would give official stamp to the document with his ring. Pontius Pilate's ring, Herod's mountain, his cruelty, all documented here at Herodium. That's monumental. That's unignorable. Only evidence we've got is the bone box. That's just nuts. Not even beginning to be close. Herod was a main character. We see other characters following, further testifying to Herod. His grandson is mentioned in Acts chapter 12, and we'll look at various chapters of Acts just seeing the various archaeological evidence that sustains it. On an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum, began delivering an address. Now, this was a period where Augustus had begun to allow people to view him as divine, and Herod was wanting to get in on the act, and now then his grandson is following suit. The people kept crying out, "The voice of a God and not of man." And the deity of the Roman rulers now is here seen and attested to by Luke in Acts chapter 12. God did not appreciate this kind of haughty, monumental ego is the opposite of the attitude God appreciates. And we read in Acts 12 verse 23, immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory. He was eaten by worms and died. The Bible tells us that God rules among the affairs of men and sets up rulers and takes them down. And we see rulers from Babylon finally being taught by God, like Nebuchadnezzar, to give glory to God. Herod was not learning and was eaten torturously by worms. Josephus describes this in detail. It took several days, according to Josephus, but died in torment. The statue shows us exactly what he looked like. Coins likewise attest to this individual, Herod Agrippa II, the grandson of Herod the Great. It kind of looks like something's eating him, doesn't it? This was a real person. And then his son, the great-grandson, known as Herod Agrippa II, is described for us in Acts 25. Here, Paul was brought before him at Caesarea Maritime that we looked at a moment ago, restored by National Geographic. Then he stayed, when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice, this is his sister that always traveled with him, rumored to be his lover, the two of them arrived at Caesarea, the place that we showed you, together with its ruins. There was a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix, and so they're bringing Paul out, who had been there for almost 2 years at this point. And he was allowed to make his defense before these two individuals. Real? Well, here's a stone that documents. The inscription is the highest order of archaeological documentation. The great King Agrippa, together with Queen Bernice, children of King Agrippa, and then refers to Felix, and then again to Herod, King Herod, as their ancestor. He's the great grandson of Herod the Great, who built all the monuments. All of that we see documented right here in stone. Now, that's in stone. That's hard to argue with. It is documentation of exactly what we read. We see further evidence from the coins that commemorate both Bernice and Herod Agrippa in picture and in writing. Coins are very helpful. They usually provide absolute dates that we can determine a strata and where to place the items that we find in it. I have a coin that I think is significant, that I believe is referred to in Matthew 22. Whose image is this? We remember the story where taxation was an issue, and Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar." Whose image is this? Well, it's Caesar's image on the coin, and this is a picture of that coin. I don't know whether that can be seen, but my wife allowed me to borrow the coin that I had purchased for her, that's 2,000 years old, that is the coin that we see pictured here, the only one in circulation at the time, a denarius, with the image of the Emperor Tiberius on it. The story of Jesus, surrender under Caesar, well, we see documentation of that and actual artifacts that can show, yep, there's the image. We see exactly what he was talking about. Now, let's move on to Acts chapter 13. And Paul and Barnabas are traveling on what's often called the first missionary journey and go to Cyprus. And there they travel across the island over to Paphos, which is there on the western side of the island. And verse 7 talks about proconsul Sergius Paulus, a man of intelligence. And the skeptics had often said, we don't have any reference to Sergius Paulus. He's supposed to be an important person. Luke is just padding the story, trying to make himself look good and Paul look good. He's converted somebody really important. Of course, Paul said not many like that are called, but there were some who were. And besides that, the skeptics said this term proconsul, nobody's ever heard of that. Who's in the world, what is a proconsul? That's not documented. In archaeology, the lack of evidence is not considered good evidence, because you may find it tomorrow. You don't know that it's not so if you just haven't found it. And so they shouldn't have talked quite so loud. In verse 12, it continues to say, he saw what happened. He was amazed at the teaching of the Lord. The proconsul believed. Well, they, of course, didn't believe. He believed. But we find archaeological documentation when fairly recently now, just outside of Paphos, a first century monument was found documenting, I've superimposed the English letters here over the Latin, Paulus, Sergius Paulus, proconsul, is right there on the stone. Both the person's name and the office is documented, and then if that is not enough. There was another stone with the same documentation near Rome, evidently carved by the same people. Put one in Paphos and one in Rome, where he was from, serving there at Cyprus. Luke knew what he was talking about. There's so many ways that you can test Luke as they travel from place to place and are under various governors at various times. And if something is out of order and out of place, it shows up. And again and again, they make claims when they don't know, only to be embarrassed when documentation like this is dug up and confirmed. Now, from Paphos on Crete, we move on Cyprus, we move on to across the Aegean Sea there in Achaia, the general area, to Corinth. Rome received a letter written from Corinth by Paul, and toward the end of Romans, he writes to from Corinth, Gaius, host to me and the whole church, greets you. Erastus, the city treasurer, greets you. What in the world is a city treasurer, a very prominent citizen in Corinth, doing in the church and giving greeting as Paul writes, obviously in close association with Paul? Well, that's just ridicule, the idea. He's trying to make him look good by converting somebody important, and nobody knows about Erastus until this pavement was found amongst the ruins at Corinth. Erastus are the words that we see up here in the upper left-hand corner, in return for his aedileship, that's a treasurer, at his own expense, and it is assumed that it goes on to say he laid this pavement. He paid for this pavement. And so we have documented the individual that Paul refers to. Furthermore, Josephus writes about Erastus and describes him as a man of dignity. A word can also mean integrity. In stone at Corinth, just as Paul said he was. Over and over again we see Luke knew exactly what he was talking about. The inspired historian got it right. There is fanatical opposition, but against that we see the stones piling up. We go on to Acts chapter 18 and we read about Gallio, another individual who was contested because we didn't know. Who had ever heard of Gallio? And again, that term proconsul initially was contested. They didn't know about that. But he's of Achaia. Achaia is the territory that surrounds and is where Corinth is. And the Jews with one accord rose up, we read in Acts 8, against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, which would imply that he's now before Gallio, the proconsul, at the judgment seat. Well, the judgment seat has been known for some time there at Corinth. That's a tourist attraction, and that's on all of the tour guides list. You see the green arrow there pointing to the sign that identifies it, and here both in Greek and in Latin, judgment seat is engraved. There the benches for the judges, and it's there in the foreground, the backdrop of the Acropolis there at Corinth. Luke says this is where Paul was brought, and he was brought there before Gallio, the proconsul. Who is Gallio, and what's this proconsul office? Ridicule just dripped out of their mouths until the inscription was found at Delphi, Greece, not at Corinth, but up the ways a little bit, an inscription by the Emperor Claudius Caesar from the same period, about 41 AD, or AD 41, at Delphi, and again the English letters superimposed to Gallio, my friend and proconsul, friend of Claudius Caesar, emperor at the right time, in the right area, proconsul over the whole area, and documentation in stone of exactly what Luke is saying, and the individual before whom Paul came at the judgment seat. That term, judgment seat, obviously left an impression. Paul was there. In Romans 14, he uses it again in verse 10. We shall all stand before the judgment seat of God, not of Gallio. But as he was there before that judgment seat, so we will be. Moving to Acts chapter 19, we find Paul in Ephesus. Well, we've excavated Ephesus in great detail. It's a major tourist attraction when you go to that area. And this is where we're told in verse 34, all with one voice cried out for 2 hours, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Now, this is absolutely monumental. We'll have to talk more about it next time. This was Diana of the Ephesians. We know all about it. Let me skip to the picture of the temple of Diana, which is monumental in itself. I'm standing here right at the base of the columns, 60 columns, 120 columns, 60 feet high. Great is Diana of the Ephesians. They're in the theater that we see here. And this was a real event that we can document, and much more. We'll talk more about that. Hope you'll be with us again next Lord's Day. And we'd like to have you worship with us at the Little Rock Church of Christ this morning at 9:30. Thank you for tuning in.